which would have nettled me more if I had not been exultantly telling myself that, once and for all, for good or ill, the Rubicon was passed. "It's your affair this time," I said. "Run it as you please." He sculled away with vigorous strokes. Just as he is, I thought to myself. Bare head, beaded with fog dew, ancient oilskin coat (only one button), grey jersey, grey woollen trousers like a deep sea fisherman's, stuffed into long boots. A vision of his antitype, the cow's philanderer, crossed me for a second. As to his face, well, I could only judge by it and marvel that he was gripping his dilemma by either horn as firmly as he gripped his sculls. I watched the two boats converging. They would meet in the natural course about 300 yards away, but a hitch occurred. First the sailboat checked and slewed. Aground, I concluded. The rowboat leapt forward still, then checked too. From both a great splashing of sculls floated across the still air, then silence. The summit of the watershed, a physical Rubicon, prosaic and slimy, had still to be crossed, it seemed. But it could be evaded. Both boats headed for the northern side of the creek. Two figures were out on the brink, hauling on two painters. Then Davies was striding over the sand, and a girl, I could see her now, was coming to meet him. And then I thought it was time to go below and tidy up. Nothing on earth could have made the Dulcibella's saloon a worthy reception room for a lady. I could only use hurried efforts to make it look its best, by plying a bunch of cotton waste and a floor brush, by pitching into racks and lockers the litter of pipes, charts, oddments of apparel, and so on, that had a way of collecting afresh, however recently we had tidied up, by neatly arranging our demoralised library, and by lighting the stove and veiling the table under a clean white cloth. I suppose about 20 minutes had elapsed, and I was scrubbing fruitlessly at the smoky patch on the ceiling, when I heard the sound of oars and voices outside. I threw the cotton waste into the forecastle, made an onslaught on my hands, and then mounted the companion ladder. Our own dinghy was just rounding up alongside, Davies sculling in the bows, facing him in the stern a young girl in a grey tam o' shanter, loose waterproof jacket and a dark serge skirt. The latter, to be frigidly accurate, disclosing a pair of workmanlike rubber boots, which, mutatis mutandis, were very like those Davies was wearing. Her hair, like his, was spangled with moisture, and her rose-brown skin struck a note of delicious colour against the sullen Stygian background. "There he is," said Davies. Never did his "Meine Freund Carruthers" sound so pleasantly in my ears, never so discordantly the "Fräulein Dollmann" that followed it. Every syllable of the four was a lie. Two honest English eyes were looking up into mine, an honest English hand. Is this insular nonsense? Perhaps so, but I stick to it. A brown, firm hand, no, not so very small, my sentimental reader, was clasping mine. Of course I had strong reasons, apart from the racial instinct, for thinking her to be English, but I believe if I had had none at all I should at any rate have congratulated Germany on a clever bit of plagiarism. By her voice, when she spoke, I knew that she must have talked German habitually from childhood. Diction and accent were faultless, at least to my English ear, but the native constitutional ring was wanting. She came on board. There was a hollow discussion first about time and weather, but it ended as we all in our hearts wished it to end. None of us uttered our real scruples. Mine indeed were too new and rudimentary to be worth uttering, so I said common-sense things about tea and warmth, but I began to think about my compact with Davies. "Just for a few minutes, then?" she said. I held out my hand and swung her up. She gazed round the deck and rigging with profound interest, a breathless, hungry interest, touching to see. You've seen her before, haven't you? I said. I've not been on board before, she answered. This struck me in passing as odd, but then I had only too few details from Davies about his days at Norderney in September. Of course, that is what puzzled me, she exclaimed, suddenly, pointing to the mizzen. I knew there was something different. Davies had belayed the painter, and now had to explain the origin of the mizzen. This was a cumbrous process, and his hearer's attention soon wandered from the subject and became centred in him. His was already more than half in her, and the result was a golden opportunity for the discerning onlooker. It was very brief, but I made the most of it, buried deep a few regrets, did a little heartfelt penance, told myself I had been a cynical fool not to have foreseen this, and faced the new situation with a sinking heart. I am not ashamed to admit that, for I was fond of Davies, and I was keen about the quest. She had never been a guilty agent in that attempt on Davies. Had she been an unconscious tool, or only an unwilling one? If the latter, did she know the secret we were seeking? In the last degree unlikely, I decided. But, true to the compact, whose importance I now fully appreciated, I flung aside my diplomatic weapons, recoiling as strongly, or nearly as strongly, let us say, from any effort, direct or indirect, to gain information from such a source. It was not our fault if by her own conversation and behaviour she gave us some idea of how matters stood. Davies already knew more than I did. We spent a few minutes on deck, while she asked eager questions about our build and gear and seaworthiness, with a quaint mixture of professional acumen and personal curiosity. "How did you manage alone that day?" she asked Davies suddenly. "Oh, it was quite safe," was the reply, "but it's much better to have a friend." She looked at me, and—well, I would have died for Davies there and then. "Father said you would be safe," she remarked with decision. A slight excess of decision, I thought. And at that turned to some rope or block and pursued her questioning. She found the compass impressive, and the trappings of that hateful centreboard had a peculiar fascination for her. Was this the way we did it in England? Was her constant query. Yet, in spite of a superficial freedom, we were all shy and constrained. The descent below was a welcome diversion, for we should have been less than human if we had not extracted some spontaneous fun from the humours of the saloon. I went down first to see about the tea, leaving them struggling for mutual comprehension over the theory of an English lifeboat. They soon followed, and I can see her now stooping in at the doorway, treading delicately, like a kitten, past the obstructive centreboard to a place on the starboard sofa, then taking in her surroundings with a timid rapture that broke into delight at all the primitive arrangements and dingy amenities of our den. She explored the cavernous recesses of the ripping-gill, fingered the duck guns and the miscellany in the racks, and peeped into the forecastle with dainty awe. Everything was a source of merriment, from our cramped attitudes to the painful deficiency of spoons and the yachtiness—there is no other word to describe it—of the bread, which had been bought at Bensersiel and had suffered from incarceration and the climate. This fact came out and led to some questions, while we waited for the water to boil, about the gale and our visit there. The topic, a pregnant one for us, appeared to have no special significance to her. At the mention of von Brüning she showed no emotion of any sort; on the contrary, she went out of her way, from an innocent motive that anyone could have guessed, to show that she could talk about him with dispassionate detachment. "He came to see us when you were here last, didn't he?" she said to Davies. "He often comes. He goes with father to Memmert sometimes. You know about Memmert? They are diving for money out of an old wreck."